Today we are going to do a little talk, maybe a new type of format that I'm trying out for some content. I have a lot of thoughts, but too slow at video production. Some old notes I'd written on this topic, why a lot of times nerds can come off unintentionally abrasive in like conversations, discussions, and debates. Feel free to hop on stream next time if you have questions or want to engage. Before turning into like another meme of psychoanalyze Coach Red Pill, you're stonewalling me. Uh, Let me first say I did study psychology in university, but I was not on the clinical side, so I'm going to do my very best not to try to armchair therapist here, and more focus on making an argument or explanation that will make sense. So let's jump into it. A lot of times, nerds can take this concept that's not oftentimes well explored called formality for granted. The reason is because we're oftentimes more comfortable than the people that we're talking to with, or I guess more used to operating within the constraints of the space. This is one of the most common reasons for getting into circular arguments and debates, and also is one of the other most common reasons why these sort of odd consistency issues start to surface. And on top of that, I think when it comes to discussion and forming positions, a lot of people also don't really understand the difference between axiomatization and formality. Axiomatization is probably conceptually a bit easier to understand the importance of, and it's maybe philosophically a little bit kind of like sexier. So I think a lot of people put more effort and focus on understanding that aspect. But formality is actually, for me, I think formality is what usually causes people to just keep talking past each other. And the reason for this is because the degree of formalization is usually assumed from both sides in a conversation, and they don't actually match up. This can happen even if both sides understand making logical arguments, like with sensible premise, like the difference between soundness and validity. It's even with a deep understanding of those two concepts, you can oftentimes have this sort of like misalignment. So what is formality? For the sake of this video, I think formality can be thought of as a dimension of systems of thought, similar to how axiomatization is. In relation, these two dimensions are independent. It deals essentially with how precisely things in your system work. To break things down a little bit, just in case this is a little bit too abstract, for basically any system, you have to have a language which is needed to state the things that you think. And then you also need an interpretation function to give those statements meaning. For example, in math, the interpretation function takes mathematical statements and tells you if they are true or not true. And the meaning here is basically truth. Math is very formal since you can basically programmatically verify the statements as mathematical, and there's a very high objectivity in how statements are interpreted. On the other hand, you could imagine maybe like a 12-year-old's rhetoric is not very formal. Statements are often, grammatically not super meaningful or sensible, and who knows on the meaning. In relation to axiomatization, you can have formal systems that aren't axiomatized. Maybe like a DFA would be an example of this. You could have axiomatized systems that aren't formal. A lot of beliefs of like political streamers, you could say, are like this. And you could have formalized and axiomatized systems. An example of this would be math. And you could also have informal and not axiomatized systems like, not to throw any shade, but to throw some shade, the beliefs of the aforementioned streamers' chats. In terms of examples, I think the streamer Destiny is someone who runs into related issues with formality actually relatively often. I remember a debate between Destiny and Vaush, which I'll link below later in the video when it gets posted to YouTube, where it seemed Destiny kept pushing for a significantly higher degree of formality than Vaush is ready for, leading to the debate equivalent of basically running into a wall over and over and over again. Um, Vaush made apparent throughout the debate he intended to somewhat vaguely traverse this line of like practicality versus ideology, and I believe this was personally, I think this was maybe due to him personally being a consequentialist while trying to argue something more ideological. While Destiny, on the other hand, kept pushing for more descriptive precision, which basically was met with very little semantic engagement and just like tonal disagreement through the whole video. I don't think, at least if I look back at that video, I don't think it would have been in bad faith to say ask for an explicit definition for utility, since Vaush was trying to argue very strongly from the consequentialist perspective. Even if it's not like a fully mathematically precise description, even a rough notion of how calculation works can really elucidate potential flaws in a person's position, or it could also establish, if they're not willing to give you that sort of formulation, that like an opponent hasn't really thought through what they think well. An example would be if you think of global utility just summing individual people's utilities. If you have negligent misalignment with claimed ideologies, this can easily lead to a global decrease in utility. I think this was brought up in the video. A vegetarian eating a burger maybe doesn't affect the meat industry, but individually has participated in assisted murder of something they basically consider as valuable as human life. And so if you add, 0 with a negative number, of course, you're going to have a negative number. And in this case, it's an obvious decrease. If I try to put myself into the context of that video and think through like the personal engagement and sort of the tension that was going on during that conversation, requesting something like, give me an explicit, more explicit explanation of your utility function out of the blue, or even assuming something for your opponent can be kind of somewhat off-putting. In the debate, I think Destiny's counter arguments seem to imply some sort of assumed idea of how global utility should be calculated that I don't know if Vaush had a very clear one in mind, at least during that time. And finally, I think one of the last points from the video that I remember that seemed fairly related to what I'm talking about, the topic of today's video, which is formality. There was this talking back and forth point about how somebody else will do it, thus it's not bad. It seemed Vaush's counter argument to a lot of Destiny's hypotheticals in pushing back against the sentiment was, well, if everyone didn't participate in the thing, then nothing bad would happen, since in the hypotheticals that Destiny was raising, for example, taking a wallet or slavery, etc., these actions were unnecessary. In retrospect, I would say this is a very tricky, almost tautological setup, in the sense that the idea seems to be everything necessary is at worst morally neutral, and anything immoral can't be necessary. So you can assign morality to whatever you want by claiming it's necessary from some perspective, and then disregard anything immoral that contradicts your beliefs by saying it is not necessary from some other perspective. It's kind of reminiscent a little bit of making non-scientific hypotheses. You'll never be wrong, which rhetorically is very effective, but it's also kind of not very interesting, since, at least from my opinion and my perspective, I think most people can pass moral judgment on relatively clear necessities. But I think in that debate, if Vaush had agreed to a touch more precision and that had been established beforehand, I think a lot of Destiny's argument techniques, his slavery hypothetical, for example, would have had a much sharper argumentation path by pinning the foundation of Vaush's counter argument to a lack of necessity. i.e., it's like not clear necessarily how um, slavery was to the South in the 1800s. Like, was it really something that they needed, for example? And you could also argue, for example, modern day retrospection maybe falls a little bit short due to us having a huge amount of technological differences that allow us to produce crops to meet, the consumption demands or consumption demands at a certain price, um, with very, very little actual human labor. Um, but I think if you did argue this would kind of be like rhetorical suicide in some way. It's very, I would say, very positionally difficult to defend that sort of thing in neutrality, especially when there was so much tension in the debate. And some other, I guess, like if we were trying to think through what I just said, but using an example without so much baggage, here's two I thought of. You could say, maybe suppose you're in a war, where maybe the command center has warned that civilians will use IEDs, and that the soldiers should kill any civilians approaching strategic points. And now you see a civilian approaching for help, and you're a soldier. Do you shoot the civilian? Morally, you might like, if you follow along Vaush's logic here, morally it might be okay because another soldier will just shoot the civilian. But if nobody shoots a civilian, you might lose the entire unit or the entire strategic point. Another one would be like if you're stranded in the mountains and somebody has their pet. Is it immoral to kill the pet against the owner's will for food? Again, it's sort of the same setup. If you don't, somebody else might do it because they're so hungry. But if nobody kills the pet, maybe everybody starves to death, and yeah, it's a much worse situation. Of course, this is in retrospect. This is in post. I'm saying these things in post production, so it's it may not be so easy to come up with these sorts of things on the spot. I'm not trying to claim that that's the case, but I feel if you were able to pin Vaush's argument essentially to this point of necessity, then by allowing yourself to focus more on a smaller part of what makes an argument work, you're able to come up with arguments that are much sharper in terms of trying to get your point across. So just to kind of review, for our purposes, formality is basically about who has responsibility for getting meaning across. If you're in a situation with more formality, it's more so kind of on the speaker, while if you're in a less formal situation, it's actually going to be more so on the listener. In a formal system, the speaker has to be very explicit and every word is exact, so you can sort of programmatically understand the intent. And it's the speaker's responsibility to make sure that the words they're saying like fit this very precise and exact like constraint system or the rules of whatever you're talking about. But in an informal system, the listener sort of has the onus of extracting the meaning from potentially very imprecise words. In the extreme limit of this sort of case, one person is just totally silent and the other person is just thinking by themselves. That's like maybe the most informal you could have when it comes to trying to have like a communication. Because of this, a sort of like immediate derivation that you can get is that progress is very closely linked to the concept of formality. If you have a very formal system, it actually becomes more likely sometimes that your insight gets, in a more formal system, it's usually the case that your insight gets accurately transmitted, assuming you know how to say the words that you're supposed to say to the other person. As long as kind of your vocabulary, your grammar, everything is about the same, and the way that you interpret stuff is about the same, then it's very easy. As long as you're able to communicate, or able to form the sentences correctly, you're able to communicate very easily. Whenever there's a disagreement as well, only one idea will walk away that's correct. And this is like a very, very important, right? because even if you have a disagreement, there's always a definitive step forward when somebody is wrong and somebody is right. The whole system, or at an individual thinker's level, this like necessarily has to occur. So, for example, math is such a developed field of study because every time somebody has a disagreement with somebody else about some sort of postulate or hypothesis or theorem or something like this, they will clash their ideas, and it's a very formal system. So you have a method of proving and disproving something, and then one of those ideas has to be correct. And when you find that out, there's now progress. The field of study has advanced one step, even in a very small scale it has. Without formality, what happens is, you see this all the time, I guess, in Twitch debates, it sounds like, is that both positions, they'll walk away and both of them won't think that they're wrong, and then just kind of complain to their supporters on Twitter or something. And it actually might be one of the reasons, or a big reason even, that Destiny, in comparison to other politics and philosophy, like influencers, quote unquote, it seems like he's actually much more progressive with how he leverages his following. For example, if I recall correctly, he'd done a lot of work with like impacting real life, like local elections, and a lot of the other political streamers that, some of them even have larger followings than him, they had not even considered that idea. That had never even crossed their minds. And like basically, if you try to take if you try to make the takeaway here into a short sentence, it's that when you think formally, it's oftentimes much easier to see what you're able to do next. That said, formality also introduces a lot of friction. And depending on your purpose, it's not always needed. Contradictions in informal systems occur all of the time and nothing breaks. I think one of the examples that were brought up, I don't remember if it was in that video or in a different video, about basically there was a situation where, say, you were at a camp and a camp counselor like eats a cookie after the last time that you're able to eat snacks or something like this. Sure, you might lose trust if the camp counselor disobeys and he doesn't get any consequences, or she doesn't get any consequences. I think Destiny himself said this, like intuitively it feels like the camp counselor is appealing to something else to do whatever they want, which actually, if you learn about the principle of explosion and you understand the way that it is derived, it is very similar to this. The thing that is being appealed to in the principle of explosion is actually the contradiction, but in a very like sort of sentimentally similar fashion. This is essentially what you could say is going on. But actually, in reality, this happens all the time, right? Like counselors or teachers or whatever, they're oftentimes just constantly breaking the rules. They're late to class and nothing happens to them. But if you're late to class, oh, now you get like points deducted or whatever, right? But these schools or these camps, they don't just suddenly shut down in anarchy because one camp counselor ate a cookie after 8 p.m. or something. Rather, if you actually try to require highly explicit camp rules and adherence, you would probably actually just get in the way of the function of those camps. So even basically without all these random theorems or shoving like some old philosophers' names or whatever down people's throats, I think the concept of formality is very valuable for both debaters and audience, nerds and not nerds, for everybody basically, to help smooth out communication and understand what's going on in a conversation or in a debate beyond just the rhetorical part. The nature of inconsistency, since the idea of axiomatization is oftentimes so central to a lot of these discussions or debates that at least I've seen online, I think it's actually a lot more nuanced than just you find one and then the other person's position is destroyed, especially when it comes to navigating things with less formality. Morals, for example, it's not so clear that it's like one contradiction and your whole thing breaks. Here's an example. You could say deduce contradicting statements from your understanding of your opponent's axioms, but your opponent's axioms are actually subtly different syntactically, or they're semantically, their feeling is actually a little bit different. And Even if you found something, like formally speaking, you found a contradiction, you may have only succeeded like ad hominem in that situation in terms of like the effect on the actual debate. And just to further kind of try to sales pitch the idea of formality, it's not just in rare systems of logic that contradictions. Like if you're so focused on axiomatization, it's not always just in rare systems of logic that contradictions don't actually have like the sort of same meaning that you might think they have. For example, proof by contradiction doesn't exist in the logical system that backs like algorithms. And people use algorithms literally every day now. So I think it's this is a pretty good example that it's oftentimes a lot more nuanced than maybe the sort of surface level understanding from reading little few articles on Google or Wikipedia or something might give you. Um, and you could even ask this question, which is like, what does an inconsistency imply if you can't derive the principle of explosion? Semantics and say like morality are going to be a lot different from math. And I think it seems unlikely most people feel inclined towards admitting that, like, say, if I find any contradiction, my whole position just collapses, especially if they like don't value a formal notion of correctness above, say, like pragmatism in terms of how they live their life with their own values. Um, Rather, I think resisting or ignoring world shattering observations personally, and then reflecting this expectation for that same degree of like charitability outwards, I feel like this is probably actually more likely to be the case for people in debates and in discussions. And That's like this is like a very good reason why I think establishing, well, first of all, understanding formality is important, and then establishing a mutual understanding of like expectations is important in a conversation, especially one that you might anticipate will have a lot of tension. And you don't want to end up in a situation where it's somewhat analogous to what happened between Destiny and Vaush, where they basically just kept talking in circles for what seemed like 45 minutes to an hour, and really nothing was going on. So the simple solution, I would say, and that I would prescribe here, is basically just a priori establish some mutual understanding of expected formality first. It allows you to call out when formality deviates from the expectation of the debate. Like if you're suddenly being too formal, you can say, hey, I think you're not being charitable enough, and this is not just like you're really explicitly calling it out, and the other person has agreed to it, and not just you calling this out with your expectation, and the other person having their own expectations, and you don't know. And it would also, I think, avoid sort of poor faith or frustration when it comes to attempting to reach mutual conclusions when disagreeing. A lot of times, I think, if there is a disagreement, at the end of the day, the final like conclusion almost always seems to be we just have to agree to disagree. And it usually feels like there's a little bit more that could be done, which is like, I agree that we disagree, but why do we disagree and why we can't seem to agree? I think that establishing that final sort of chunk can be helped a lot by having clearer understanding of formality when it comes to these sorts of debates. So that's pretty much it. That was my little ramble or notes spiel on formality, and I hope that this is a concept that can become a little bit more common, I guess, in online discussion about, say, politics or philosophy or anything like this. It's something that I think would be, at least from a viewer's perspective, an audience member's perspective, it would be a lot less frustrating to see a conversation between two seemingly fairly intelligent people, just result in like a circle of 5 statements over and over again. So nice. Thanks for watching, and hope that this was helpful for any of you guys.